My question is, when it comes to, and this might be open to everybody, but Dr. Browning, you might start. Is there value to having those representations of minorities be the victims in these stories, or having diversity in these different roles? Oftentimes, like I said, a diversity for like heroes and the protagonists of films, it makes a lot of sense why we would want those. But I'm curious, I want to expand more on the minorities and other positions of like victimhood.
Okay, well, I think as Dr. Graves was pointing out, when we see we'll just say horror after 9/11, that's really when we start to see this shift. We start to call it now the post-millennial Gothic, and that's where essentially audiences got fed up with allowing themselves to always be these monsters, and they talked to Hollywood in the best way they could, which is in their checkbook. And when they stop going to see these movies, or they start getting really upset, Hollywood finally listened. And now, as was basically brought up by Dr. Graves, the villain, the villainy, the bad guy or bad girl, whatever the case may be, what it tends to be is whoever decides what normalcy is. So you'll even see horror movies where you think this obvious monster is the monster, but really that monster's okay. I mean, Hellboy's okay. The vampires in True Blood, they're okay. Even the vampires in Twilight are okay, so on and so forth. And or even Monsters Inc., for Pete's sake. But what ends up happening is it's whoever decides what normalcy is, whoever decides what is superior and inferior, they end up becoming the monster or the bad guy in these films. But that, I think, is two sides of the same coin that also Dracula's victims belong to. So we now finally get the dignity of being Dracula's victims, because we weren't before, because they were segregated certain types of victims into non-visualized or non-procreative or non-consumed. So the fact that we see the monsters, as Dr. Grace is pointing out, being whoever decides what normalcy is also the same exact influence that's allowing queer people, people of color, women, etc., becoming the victims to Dracula. So I think it's speaking to the same sort of politics.
Cool, thanks. Did you want to add anything?
Thank you. Just that I think that in a world where we sometimes have to take what we can get, like some representation is, even bad representation is better than no representation at all. And as a kid, like I found Mr. Green in the film Clue, like very inspiring. He's not even actually gay in the film, it turned out at the end, but still, it was like one of the few instances where I got to see something like that in media around me. And growing up in like a tiny, small Southern town, that was important. Like, even though it's played very stereotypically, it's played for comedy, he's the heel of the joke, right? I think it's better when representation is complex the way that humanity is complex. I will, always push for better representation. That's not to say that minorities cannot be figured as the bad guy, for sure, but it is to say that we need some of both.
Yeah, I like how you made my question more complex. I appreciate that. Anything else? Go ahead.
I have a question, I think, that integrates both of your presentations. And as I heard both of y'all present, I hear on the one side selective victimology, on the other side corporeality. I wonder, could you all talk a bit about how both of those things function as mechanisms of biopolitical control, or if you see it that way or not, just to kind of tie it to the contemporary moment some?
Let's go.
That's a big question. That is a really big question. When it comes to kind of like, if a system of government or whatever apparatus can control what you fear, then they can control like your bodily reaction to that and to like a large degree. So I think there's certainly something to be said there in terms of, I don't know that it's always necessarily intentionally deployed as kind of like biopolitical machinations, but you know, our physiology, our psychology, they're very tied together. So where your head goes, your body goes, follows along with it. So yes, I think there's an interesting connection there. I want to think more about that.
Yeah, sure.
It's a complicated question, but it's a good one.
I think I was much the same way as Dr. Gray's at first. I'm like, wow, where do I take this? But then I remembered the whole one way of looking at Dracula's victimology, at least before the year 2000, let's just say at least before the mid 70s, is really a response to the Hays Code, the production code. I always find it laughable, and my students laugh, that this production code was written because it represented the best morals, okay, particularly by the Catholic Church at the time, and that there wasn't anything political about it. It's just about good, upstanding American morals. And I'm like, what are you talking about? It says you can't have relationships between people of different races. And it really meant black and white races. You can't have any inference of sex perversion, which they meant gay people. When we think of sex perversion today, our minds don't usually go to gay people, but that's what the Hays Code meant. So there's a lot of groups that are completely excluded, and they're told you must exclude these groups. So in terms of biopolitics, they're really showing America through the production code who is allowed visibility and who isn't, and who is worthy of visibility and who isn't. And the same thing goes for the way it really controlled Dracula's victimology. That's why we don't see Dracula even taking non-white victims until the 70s. And it had to happen in Europe, which means they were out of the reach of the production code. So we don't really see it interfering with Dracula's victimology anymore until I think by the late 70s. But then it came down to, do major corporations want, like Universal Studios, so they want to get on the side of all these new, movements that were spawned in the 70s or pushes in the 70s, like the continuation of the civil rights movement, student unrest, anti-war, women's lib, the gay rights movement, and a lot of studios chose not to join those bandwagons. So we really don't start to see, especially with AIDS in the 80s, we really see vampire films and Dracula films avoiding the politics of the bite and just say, well, Dracula goes for women because it's just about consumption. It's not sexual, except he only ever goes for the opposite sex. So it's incredibly sexual. That of course stops with 9/11, at least afterwards. So there's definitely a lot of biopolitics involved in the production code and the way it interferes with Dracula's victimology. Yeah.
Anything that?
Thank you very much. This is just like a follow-up question. Thinking broadly about how the idea of selective victimology plays out in online spaces, what are your thoughts around the debates of free speech and hate speech?
You mean who is worthy of free speech?
Yes.
Even if the speech they want to give is anti-free speech or anti-progressive politics. How do I approach this? I guess let people. I think especially young people have been trained well, especially through various media and Hollywood especially, to be able to determine if that kind of speech is good or not. It used to be very different when only certain people had access to being able to have their voices heard, so they only heard one side. If those kinds of speeches and that kind of free speech has to happen, that even would, if it had its way, would end free speech for people that typically have their voices, stamped on. I guess it has to happen. But I think, at least with my students over the years, and I've seen these changes over the last 20 years of teaching at the university level, that students are, at least before Trump, were getting to the point where they thought even me bringing up race, class, gender, sexuality was becoming passe. Like, are there really still people that have a problem with these things? And I was like, well, we see less of it now in Hollywood, especially in horror, but yes, and especially now with the two Trump administrations, there's definitely, but I still think it's part of the old guard. I don't think it's a young new guard. So.
It's a tricky question, right? Because if I would like to maintain my ability to exercise free speech, I need to then defend other people's ability to exercise free speech, even if I disagree with what they say. So I think really it comes down to people, it comes down to access to education and being exposed to different kinds of people than your own, like to different cultures, to things like that, where you're not suspicious of everything you encounter. And then you can also sort of like filter what somebody says with kind of a critical lens. Because, there's, of course, like fraudulent speech or, things like incitement to violence. Yeah, I'll take exceptions to that. But I think it is a core value of like the democratic experiment that we're free to be critical. And that's what we're seeing a lot of happening now, is people who are being critical being punished in some way in kind of a scary fashion. I can't read the news anymore without like just being really tense. So and who's allowed in the room is a question too of free speech, right? Like the Trump administration banned the AP from being in the press room. Like that is not really censorship exactly, but it is denying access to, a news service that we rely on for kind of like just the facts man sort of reporting. So I think that we live in fraught times. I didn't wrap that up well. But yeah, if we want to be able to hear from minority voices, we have to protect all minority voices, right? We can't really pick and choose.
So this is interesting that you bring this up, because this was actually something that Korbyn and I were talking about just exactly a week ago. This censorship, this fear of censorship, and what our role as teachers is in all of this. And specifically, you, Dr. Graves, you talked about this in your presentation. This new kind of TikTok censorship or YouTube censorship that we've been seeing, where terms like SA are being used instead of rape, which to me are can be two very different things. And I think we lose a lot of severity when we don't call things what they are.
It lessens the rhetorical impact.
Exactly. And it makes things less, in some cases, it can make things less true, especially if we're looking at that list that you gave us of just identity words. Like you can't say Black or female. So it's scary times for sure. But I guess my question is, what do we think about this in terms of, are we going to be desensitized to things that we should be afraid of if we stop calling things what they are? Or are we going to like end up re-villainizing things that we lose this representation of as we become more censored and as we kind of lean more into what seems like we're coming into a more conservative time? That was a long question.
But good, and an important one. I think that we're kind of at I hate to invoke the cliche of the tipping point, but I think we're kind of in a moment where like we all need to consciously make the choice of, are we going to confront these restrictions on the way that we talk about the world around us, or are we going to, capitulate to them and work within the system? Because being in the system it comes down to like the Audre Lorde quote about, you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools, right? Like, can you tear down X by using X, by tweeting? I refuse to call it anything else, but it's like, are you going to be able, like, I don't think you can just like, I think people have been trying since Musk kind of like took over, and it's not going great, but Yeah, I think we're at a point where we all kind of have to consciously decide what path we're going to take when we encounter these kinds of restrictions. And it's really kind of a kind of censorship.
Yeah, I mean, Korbyn and I talked about like maybe you can if you're sneaky about it. So we've been looking into like mischief research. So yeah, I think you just have to be careful
Yeah.
with how you do that if you're going to do that.
If anybody reads anything I've published, they're going to be like, well, we can't hire her.
Since, yeah, Emily mentioned it, we have been talking a lot kind of about, I'm a very practical focused researcher. So maybe just to expand or add to this question, for either you or Dr. Browning, I'm curious, like, you talk about this choice as like a fork in the road, either you're with us or against us. Is there any space in between, or for people who might not feel like they have they can't take the risk or have enough security to join the rebellion? Is there a way that those people can still resist and not do so like overtly?
It's a damn good question. I'm all about people protecting themselves. Everyone needs to do that, you know, to an extent, to a great extent. But I also wish the people that that belong to a group would stand up. If more of us that belong to a minority, especially an oppressed minority, would stand up, we'd have more numbers and more people would listen. I can't blame them for not doing it. You know, it feels like we're going in reverse with the exclusion of these different words. We're going back to the production code. In fact, that mischief, creativity that you were talking about, that's the way in pre or post production code films. That's the way visibility was there. You would sneak in, like with Dracula's daughter, you would sneak in a lesbian vampire and code it in a way where the bright people knew what she was, but the production code didn't. And so the way we're having to do now just to get around it is literally going back to what creatives had to do during that period. Now we don't have to be that way anymore, at least not until this Trump era. So I hope we don't have to go back to that point where, again, as you were pointing out, with pre 9/11 horror, and I explain this to my students because I love how they grew up during the era of the post-millennial Gothic. Like they've only known good monsters. It's rare for them to find a bad monster. What ends up being a bad monster to them is someone who, again, decides what normal is and who is superior. But all the other monsters are good guys and good gals, you know, or good days. Yeah. But I have to explain to them that it wasn't like that in Hollywood for like 100 years. You know, you would have monsters that would have fangs and talons, but also be a little black or a little gay or a woman or a woman who is masculine or someone who is non-Christian, etc. And they're like, really? Like, yes. Basically, it was horrible. But there were also actors that were black who would play those monsters roles because at least they got some visibility. They got something. It wasn't the best, but at least other people in their group got to see their likeness on the screen. Same thing for anyone in the LGBTQ plus community. So I hope we don't go back to those days. I don't think we will. I think it will take enough of us, like Dr. Graves was saying, to just say no. But if you really want to make a point, and Trump tends to listen to this, at least he used to, is talk to the corporations, hit them where they hurt most, and that's in their pocketbook. So if there's a way to figure out how exactly we did this with the post-millennial Gothic, we need to figure out where we can say no and it cause revenue to go down for shareholders. Once you start affecting shareholders, they listen.
And I think that, you know, people who are in positions of precarity, you often have to choose, like, would I like to continue having a job or would I like to take a grand moral stand, right?
Mhm.
And I'm not going to castigate anyone who makes the choice to, you know, be quiet about their actual feelings. And there are hundreds of tiny ways to resist things like this. And I think too, what becomes really important is for people who are not in a perceived minority group. to become loud. People who can't be persecuted for being female or a person of color or openly queer, like people who are kind of part of that perceived establishment. The more that they speak up and, you know, not let somebody get away with telling, you know, a horrible racist joke around them or something, like call people out on the kind of language they use and the way that they talk about people. So I think that that becomes really important, kind of like other side to people who can't resist, need somebody else to be resisting for them.
Allies.
Yeah,
We need more allies.
like actual allyship, not performative
Yeah.
allyship.
That's a no-no. Yeah. Did you hear that they also, I think it was, what's his name, Texas Senator Cruz, yeah, who marked biodiversity because he didn't understand what biodiversity meant when talking about ecosystems, but he just saw diversity. I'm like, sir, that's not what you're talking about. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, the word historically being on that list, I'm gonna be thinking about that.
Like outright things that are getting application. So that tells us, and that is a very clear communication of what kind of research they would like to be funding, and it does not have anything to do with health disparities or economic disparities or any kind of minority groups. So there we go. When they tell you who they are, believe them.
Yeah.
Anything else? Anything else? You guys got any questions? No biggie otherwise, but
No pressure.
yeah, there's a microphone over there too.
Hi there. I've really enjoyed listening to the conversations just about fear and just, I don't know, my mind has been open to so many new ideas. I come from a rhetoric and writing background. And as I was thinking, since we've kind of defined fear as something that's impending, and we've seen fear in our current society, you can argue that fear can lead to a more progressive outcome, but it could also lead to a regressive outcome. But I'm thinking, what is your opinion on a society without fear? Is that bound to fail, or is that the goal?
That's a fun question. You want to start answering?
Well, we definitely have reached that point, at least again, before Trump, where people were not afraid or being trained to be afraid of people of color or queer people or women or non-Christian people or disabled people. That was great with the post-millennial Gothic. Now they're essentially we're being trained to fear whoever is telling you how to live your life, fear whoever is creating this dichotomy or this hierarchy rather of who deserves respectability and who doesn't. If we ever get to the point where we don't have to fear that anymore, it's because it's gone away and we no longer have people a part of that old guard, as I call it. So I would love for that to happen if we don't have that system. But I don't know. This is obviously not true, but I feel like some people are just hardwired to be afraid of something ingrained in them, that's something that is different from them. And there are others that can make really good money on inciting that fear. So I don't know if we'll ever get to that point.
I think that fear actually serves like an important social function. It keeps us from all acting out our, first impulses of things a lot of times. What I would like to see is for us to relocate the sites of fear to things like the warming climate and extinction of species and, lack of affordable housing. Like, I wish that we were afraid of things that were solvable instead of just like identity differences. So I don't think fear will ever go away, but I think we can work to shift where it's located or what direction it's aimed.
I'll add too. I think I read a book once called How moral revolutions happen. And one of their thesis was that shame drove those moral revolutions, and it was people that were pointing out and criticizing and refuting Chinese foot binding that eventually made it to where it's a taboo practice now in those countries. So I think that fear and the fear of shame is also something that, to Graves' point, I think is valuable in our society. And the fear of what other people like, fear of being a bad person, I think is a good fear to have and to propagate and encourage. So yeah, I agree. I don't think a world without fear is one that I'm looking forward for and trying to create.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. I loved your answers. All good. Thank you.
Let me see. Like historically, like in the past 100 or 200 years in the U.S., do you think like education played a major role in how fair was managed in the youth? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you very well.
You want me to say it?
Yeah, can you repeat
Oh.
the question?
Historically in the U.S. in like the past 200 years to like the Civil War and to like today, do you think education played like a major role in how fair was like fostered and managed in the youth?
Did education play a role?
As a college professor, I feel like I have to say yes. But yeah, I genuinely think it did, especially like increased literacy rates even has a significant effect on kind of like our perception of the world, because then you can read things from other ideologies and start to filter them for yourself.
I mean, even in film, sound was a godsend to a lot of people because there were a lot of illiterate people when talkies came around and starting in 1927. So for them to not have to rely on intertitles, the cars that tell them words and stuff, and they could rely on what the characters are saying and also their nonverbal communication. That was great. Unfortunately, the people behind the scripts, and it wasn't necessarily all their fault, but they were told what they could and could not show. In fact, if you ever reach out into film history, look at the pre-code talkies, those talking pictures between about 1929 and 1934 July. They're really great. They're extremely woke. Lots of powerful women.
Ruining it for everybody.
Yeah, it was great. In fact, it was that culmination of those films that made Catholics so fearful that they incited the possibility of a boycott, which is what made Hollywood run screaming, because they were already in the midst of the Great Depression, and a boycott with millions of Catholics would definitely make a lot of these companies go under. But anyway, I digress. The talkies were great in terms of bypassing a part of education that many viewers didn't have. Unfortunately, the people behind this new exchange of verbiage were, of course, just justifying the status quo. And what ends up happening are the people that typically don't get a voice or really not getting a voice. It really took the production code to go away before people could actually start to see themselves in a good light in cinema, especially people of color or gay people or anyone who was non-Christian even. So education in cinema has been hard fought, to put it mildly.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It gave me a lot to think about. Not a big horror fan, I don't watch a lot of films, but I wanted to talk a bit about the monsters, right? I feel like as human beings, like we always need a monster to sort of unify us and to fight against. And so I was curious about maybe the changing nature of monsters. You mentioned, Dr. Browning, when you talked about Dracula, that he was, always sort of, I guess, framed against like the Christian. We saw the nuns in the clip. So like there's a clear divide between good and evil. Having just seen another film recently, which I won't mention because I know some people haven't seen it yet, but it seems to me like the monsters were more nuanced. And so I'm wondering if you could maybe speak to that in terms of maybe the changing nature of monsters in some of these films.
Yeah, monsters, with young people anyway, it's before they were all guilty until proven innocent. And with the production code, all monsters have to die by the end of the film, or all villains, or they can be maimed horrifically or go to jail. So after the production code is gone and we start getting especially into the post-millennial Gothic after 9/11, that's when we have these young people that grew up in this environment where it's not guilty until proven innocent, and you're never proven innocent. Now it's you're innocent until proven guilty. And even films that like to hint at, oh, there's this big new scary thing, but actually it's not that scary at all. It just looks different. Just like you look different from it. You could be a monster to it for all you know. And again, it goes back to who is really deciding what is monstrous and what isn't. My students, I'm so glad they grew up with that and didn't have to grow up with the kind of cinema that a lot of us older folks had to. What else can I say about this? I think we're going to continue to, I think Hollywood is going to keep playing or keep fighting the good fight. And we're going to see even more of this. At this point, we have to call it something different from post-millennial Gothic, because now it's like this new big extra push that has to happen to say, no, we're not going anywhere. You're still the bad guy. You're still not allowed to tell people how they're supposed to look or who they're supposed to go to bed with or fall in love with or what skin color they can have. No, that's still bad. You must have missed the day they talked about reverse racism, but that's what Trumpers are doing right now. You mean I can't do this? I can't have access to these things that were set up to help minorities, because of you people. And just because you don't have access and you're upset about it, it's called reverse racism. You can't use that, as an excuse. So anyway, I think Hollywood is going to be on the right side of this battle for a change.
Which has a lot to do with who the creative forces are now.
Yeah. Yeah.
We've infiltrated.
Yes. Infiltration. And also it's good for their pocketbook to have monsters that are helping us redefine what normalcy is. So I think we're going to keep having monsters that are, do we even call them monsters anymore? When they're just, okay, they're diversity. They're the way things should be. I think we're going to keep pushing in that direction.
And I think too, when I'm thinking about the Interview with the Vampire series, where there are certainly monstrous things about these characters, but we're afforded their interiority. And so they're nuanced, they're complex, right? So it makes us question that knee-jerk reaction of labeling something as monstrous. It works on us in a way that makes us really have to define, well, what is monstrousness for ourselves, right? Because we do feel so, empathetic toward certain points in the story. We feel sympathy or, for these characters, and we kind of understand the journey. And a lot of it has to do with just kind of sophisticated storytelling, I think. So terrible at ending a statement.
It's okay. Is there, we have time for about one more question. Does anybody else have a question they would like to ask?
So, Dr. Graves, you kind of touched on this, but just as a follow-up to some of the things you talked around, how can we recognize the difference between an unhealthy fear, like a fear of other or fear of the unknown, versus a healthy fear that pushes us into a space of learning?
I think that I think a lot of it has to do with questioning, like, is this a received fear? Did somebody teach me this fear, or give me this fear, tell me this is something I should be afraid of? Or is this something I'm just afraid of because of my like fragile humanity or whatever, right? So because I think there's like an emancipatory like potential for fear where you can invert what we are afraid of, right? The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. I wrote a book on it, so I think about it a lot. But there you have like witches who are, we're supposed to be afraid of witches, but that show shows us actually we should be afraid of the patriarchy who's trying to control everybody. Right? So yeah, it's like, is it a received fear? Where's the source of the fear? I think, is it external or is it internal? I think is where we have to start.
Is it a fear rooted in exclusion?
Yeah.
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 Mm.
And I'm sure like some people would, be like, yeah, this fear is totally rational. And everybody's maybe not the best judge of rationality, but we all gotta do what we can.
Cool. Thank you, everybody. Let's go ahead. Let's give an applause for people that participated in the roundtable. Thank you. Thank you. All right, Ashton has a few announcements. If we can get the QR code on the slides here, we'll just send you on your way.
All right, as our media person is getting a QR code on the screen, again, thanks everyone for your feedback. Thank you all for coming. We want to remind you of the official conference that starts tomorrow. 7:30 a.m. is the start time. 4 p.m. is when we will close up. Throughout that time, we'll have a series of papers, presentations, and interactive workshops prepared to explore, even in more depth, how we might learn from fear. We invite you to come to join us in those discussions and in those activities. Tomorrow, there will Panera Bread will be catering breakfast, so please come and be a part of that. Again, starting at 7:30 a.m. And please note that it is on the second floor of Patterson Hall. That is the second floor of Patterson Hall inside the lobby. You're free to come and go as you please. And for more details, just please scan the QR code that is showing on the projector, and we hope to see you there tomorrow at 7:30 a.m. And we'll wrap up at 4 p.m. Again, thank you for coming.